stratification by age. In this chapter, we will cover 3 modules: aging in society, aging worldwide. So we'll look at how aging is taking place around the globe, and then we'll look at age stratification and what that looks like in the United States. So in our look ahead, we're going to ask these questions. How do people's roles change as they age? What are the social implications of the growing number of elderly in the U.S.? And how does ageism affect an older person's employment opportunities? Age, like race or gender, is socially constructed, just like we've talked about those other topics in the previous chapters. It is an ascribed status. So we're going to look and examine the attitudes towards age and aging through the life course. All societies have some system of age stratification that associates certain social roles with distinct periods in our life. Now, this age stratification varies from culture to culture, just like gender. In some societies, older people are treated with great reverence and respect. In some societies, they're viewed as unproductive members of society. All societies, though, have some system of age stratification that associates certain social roles with those distinct periods of life. Age stratification, however, goes beyond the physical constraints on a person at a certain age. Just like we wouldn't expect a child to go off to war or hold down a full-time job, we also would not expect an older person to handle tasks beyond their physical limitations. Now, being older is a master status that is commonly something that overshadows all the other statuses that we hold. So if we're looking at the United States, being old, that master status is that commonly overshadows all others. So even if you were a doctor or a lawyer, male or female, it's being old that becomes our master status later in life. And there are a lot of negative stereotypes that contribute to elderly discrimination as being a minority group. So we'll talk a little bit more about how we describe age in the categories of minority group. Designating the label old has a major impact on how others perceive individuals as well as how they view themselves. A crucial difference between older people and other subordinate or minority groups is that all those who live long enough will assume the ascribed status of being an older person. So we may not ever know what it's like to walk in another person's shoes, whether they be, if we're female, what it's like to be male, or whatever race or ethnicity that we are, what it's like to be a person of another race or ethnicity. But all of us, should we live long enough, will eventually assume that ascribed status of an older person. So we will know what it's going to be like to walk in that person's shoes, because we are going to be at that age at some point. So as I mentioned, the characteristics of, or the properties of, a minority or subordinate group can be applied to older people in the U.S. So the 5 basic properties are these. First, the older people will experience unequal employment treatment. They will face prejudice and discrimination, so they do experience that. Number 2, older people share physical characteristics that distinguish them from younger people. So if I were in, face-to-face with you in class, what did you think about it? What are those characteristics? Many older people, they might wear glasses because our eyesight starts to be affected, our hearing, hair starts to turn gray, skin wrinkles. So there's a lot of, we get a little weaker in general. Our reflexes are a little slower, reaction times to things. So there's definitely physical differences that start to change as we age. cultural preferences and leisure activities, for elderly people often differ from the rest of society. A lot of seniors like to go play bingo maybe and go down to the casinos, things like that. So they do a lot of senior groups activities that might be different than what younger people might be who are more active. Although the aging population today, which we'll talk about, is much more active than in generations past. Number 3, my membership in this group is involuntary, which means, we don't choose to. If we could choose, we'd want to stay younger and vibrant and all that. But it is involuntary. We have no choice. We do age. Older people, number 4, older people have a strong sense of group solidarity. And this is shown by participation in, those senior citizens groups, the centers, retirement communities, and even advocacy organizations. And lastly, older people generally marry others of comparable age. So, again, still trying to find somebody who has, similar characteristics as themselves. Now, there are no clear-cut definitions for the different periods of the aging cycle in the U.S. Aging is an important aspect of socialization, that process where we learn cultural norms and values of society. So when we look at the cycle of aging, old age typically begins at about age 65, the age that retirement generally begins for workers. However, with the increase in life expectancy, there's this move to really refer to people in their 60s as the young old, distinguishing them from those in their 80s and older as the old. So we're starting to even break it down further. Now, in order to study the particular problems of the elderly, of a specialized field, there is this, it's called gerontology. It's that specialized field of research that was developed. Now, gerontology is the specific study of sociological and psychological aspects of aging and problems of the aging. And there's a heavy reliance on sociological principles and theories in gerontology. Gerontologists also use psychology, anthropology, physical education, counseling, and medicine in studying the aging process. So it's a lot of disciplines wrapped up into that one category. So a gerontologist might refer to a senior person to a physical therapist, to strengthen their muscles and help them with balance and counsel them and a variety of other things. So there's a lot of disciplines wrapped up in studying the aging process. Now, our 3 sociological approaches are these: the functionalist approach, which will focus on disengagement theory; the interactionist approach, which will focus on activity theory and labeling theory; and then the conflict approach, which critiques the functionalist and interactionist for not really considering the impact of the social structure on aging patterns. So first, our functionalist perspective. Elaine Cumming and William Henry introduced what is known as disengagement theory, and they studied elderly people in both good health and good economic circumstances. And, found that, many older people are socially isolated, and they, their social roles start to, diminish. They reduce the number of social roles that they're engaging in. So a disengagement theory refers to the mutually severing of the many relationships between the aging individual and society. So according to this theory, the passing on of those social roles from one generation to the next functions to ensure social stability. Based on this theory, the approach of death forces people to drop most of their social roles, retiring from their jobs, doing maybe volunteer work, things like that. So there's been much controversy around this theory, so that gerontologists and sociologists instead see the elderly in terms of their social connectedness, their post-retirement employment, and their volunteerism. In order to help maintain connectedness, since 2008, there's been a real noted growth in computers, purchasing of computers, and seniors in senior centers taking computer classes to learn how to use the internet, and also digital cameras and webcams and social media outlets to kind of stay connected with family members that might be a distance away. So the elderly market is has grown much in those areas, and also in retirement homes. Some places have been known to show seniors, playing a Wii console, the WII, where they can play bowling and tennis and all kinds of recreational activities. It's really to help maintain fun and activity, and that connectedness with others. Critics of disengagement theory claim that the elderly, according to this theory, are forced into that involuntary and even painful withdrawal from the paid labor and meaningful social relationships. So it's really not necessarily that mutual severing that many had hoped for. An interactionist perspective, staying active and maintaining strong social networks are a very important part of a healthy lifestyle for most people, for all of society. Older people involved in networks and changing social roles, we see, try to really have to make an effort to stay active and stay connected with others. Therefore, in contrast to that disengagement theory, activity theory argues that elderly people who remain active and socially involved are better adjusted. Social interaction can lower our death rate. Among elderly, it's been noted in research that social interaction often lowers the death rate among the elderly. Their improved health has really strengthened this position of activity theorists. Older people have the same need for social interaction as any other age group. The internet is a new method for keeping the elderly in touch with family and friends who may not visit very frequently, or who are, live a distance away. Activity theorists will focus on potential contributions of elderly. Aging citizens feel satisfied when they can still be very useful and productive, like they were when they were in the paid labor force. So you see a lot of, in terms of activity theory, you see a lot of elderly people engaging in activity that is unpaid labor. So, many people volunteer at a hospital, excuse me, or if they were a teacher in their paid occupation, they may become tutors. And I see a lot of seniors in the library whenever I take my sons. They are engaged in activity, tutoring young students in the libraries. You might also see a lot of seniors working at a lot of the craft centers, teaching crafts, arts and crafts, and some of the. So doing something that makes, elderly people feel still useful and productive. Here is if you look at the links in the original PowerPoint slides and click on these are just some videos I show in class that will highlight a couple seniors who are learning how to use the webcam on their computer. And they push some buttons. They don't realize the webcam is actually videoing them, but they think they were just taking a picture. Here again are some texting codes that you might need to be a little careful at when you're texting with maybe an elderly relative. So just be careful, when you're using your texting codes. ATD means at the door. BFF means best friend fell. So you may need to be there to help. BTW means bring the wheelchair. BYOT means bring your own teeth. FWIW means forget where I was. GGPBL means gotta go, pacemaker battery low. GHA, got heartburn again. LMDO, laughing my dentures out. OMMR is on my massage recliner. And OMSG, oh my, sorry, gas. And then there's the rolling on the floor laughing and I can't get up. And the last one is talk to you louder. So be careful with those texting codes. Okay, so again, communication is really a key, and I think making light of it in the texting codes, but it does make staying active and staying in the communication with family and friends is very key. We saw earlier on in the material that when social interaction was lacking and missing, like in the cases of Jeannie and children in isolation, as seniors get older and they may not be as active, and even during times like now when we're in this pandemic and we have to remain socially distant and socially isolating, still finding ways to remain active is important. And so for many elderly who are at high risk of being very sick with this pandemic, it's really important to kind of find ways to remain active and keep some humor into the relationship. So the next theory within the interactionist perspective is the labeling theory. And labeling theorists view old age as a life stage that is defined by society. We label, the old. So old age is a life stage that's defined. Society's begun to reconsider what makes a person old. Since 1975, social scientists have suggested that old age not be defined by as how old you are, but rather how long you can be expected to live. So as life expectancy lengthens, the age at which someone is labeled old rises. And so some suggest the threshold of old age should begin in the last 10 or 15 years of a person's expected life, beginning really around the age 70 or 75. So in the United States, if we look at life expectancy of people in the U.S., that's where we should be at, not 65. But gosh, the AARP starts sending out membership cards when you turn 50. So again, this is really this line where we decide again why somebody is considered old. Is again a social construction, is how we're viewed in society. If you remember when we were really young and if somebody asked, what do you consider old? Remember, I was like in my 20s or 30s, and little children I was, when I was training to become a teacher would say I was old at 20 and 30. So again, it's really relative. The age at which one is labeled old vary, again, from culture to culture as well. So, for example, life in the U.S., where physical health and life opportunities are generally better, we consider 70 is the new 60, compared to countries where health is weakened and support systems are not quite there, like in places like Russia, where and places like that. So people might age or seem older than they actually are. According to the labeling perspective, many people would rather be considered old later rather than sooner. And so organizations like the AARP advocate for the elderly and believe in a very broad definition that includes offering that membership, again, as I mentioned, as young as 50. Remember when I turned 50 and I got that first invitation in the mail. Now, according to conflict theorists, the treatment of older people reflects the many divisions in our society. The low status is seen in prejudice and discrimination against them, in age segregation, and in unfair job practices. The elderly are victimized by social structure, and their social roles are often devalued. Social class has an impact on the lives of the elderly. For example, upper class generally have better health. They tend to have the resources such as pension plans and retirement packages and insurance benefits to assist them in their later years. Working class, however, face greater health hazards. They depend heavily on Social Security benefits and private pension funds, and their fixed incomes can barely keep up with the rising costs. So again, depending on your social class, even earlier in life, it will have an impact on your life later in the later years. Finally, then transition from agricultural economies to industrialization and capitalism have not always been beneficial to the elderly, because as production methods change, the roles may not longer be relevant. So you see a lot of companies might phase some people out, and if people age, they may not feel as comfortable learning new tasks. So here we have our different perspectives again, so we're getting some more practice with our theoretical perspectives as it pertains to aging. Sorry, my picture's covering that part of the slide, but I will definitely read that out for you. So now this module we're going to talk about, we'll just look at some demographics in terms of what's happening and why it's really important to study aging worldwide. As of 2010, actually, we're going to look at the most current data. By 2018, more than 686 million people are considered to be age 65 and older. This makes up about 8 to 9% of the world's population. It's projected that by 2045, that 15% of the world's population will be over the age of 65. It's more than double. So a major reason for this is that many societies have reduced the incidence of disease and resulting in the reduction of the death rate. So people are living longer, particularly in industrialized countries, Europe and North America. These nations have a high and steady rising proportion of older people. Europe's population is older than any of the others. And Japan, too, has an older population with a life expectancy of 84 years compared to 79 in the United States. Now, if we look specifically at males and females, men are expected to live to age 74.1 and women 79.5. Women, research has shown over and over again that women tend to live longer than men. And you want to think about why that might be so. And some of the reasons, and again, you got to look at more of the research, but some of the research that I've looked at shows that women tend to go to doctors a little bit more frequently than men. So anything that might be wrong, they kind of catch it early. Also, men are involved in, their jobs might be a little bit more risky. We see more risk-taking behaviors among men. You also have, higher rates of heart disease and smoking and alcohol use. Although women, show evidence of that as well, but it's just a little bit more frequently in men. And again, if they're not going to the doctor as frequently, they may not catch something early. So again, there's some explanations as to why that might be the case. In most developing countries, people over 60, this is what that last bullet is, people over 60 are more likely to be in poorer health as compared to those in industrialized nations or countries. And this table we see where the world's oldest countries are compared to the United States. We're ranked at, I believe that's 45, it's a small number. But Japan, again, is one of the oldest countries versus the U.S. And what you would want to consider here is what factors, what is their diet, what is their, what are they doing that's resulting in longer life expectancy. Now we'll talk about role transitions throughout the life course. Socialization, again, as we talked about earlier in the course, is a lifelong process. We tend to experience things differently at various points in our life's course. How we move through that life course varies dramatically depending on our personal preferences and some circumstances. So these preferences and circumstances are often influenced by social factors such as race, class, and gender. Psychologist Daniel Levinson identifies a number of developmental and transitional periods in the life course. So transition number 1 begins with adulthood, which typically occurs when an individual either moves out of their parents' home, starts a career, or gets married. Now, men and women both enter the next transition, which is the midlife transition, or the stage which is also known as the midlife crisis. And this begins around age 40 for both men and women. I know a lot of men get the rap for going into that midlife crisis, but women experience it as well. And this is the period of a stressful evaluation, self-evaluation, in which many individuals realize that they have little time left to achieve some, if not all, of their goals. Middle-aged adults not only face the challenges of career and life partner, but also caring for 2 generations at once. So you're facing a lot of, today's mid-aged individuals are facing a lot of things at this time. And if you're starting a family, realizing, okay, I don't have much time, but you're also caring for elderly family members too. So for many men, it's, am I in a career that makes me happy, that is making enough of a living to support my family? Or just, simply, did you achieve some of the dreams? Like maybe your dream was to always, to make enough to buy a, expensive car, like a Mercedes or whatever popular car is these days, or a motorcycle for that matter. So you see a lot of people in their midlife try to achieve. Maybe it was always somebody's dream to play the piano, and so taking lessons or play golf or something like that. We see a lot of people try to do this in this midlife age. At the same time, you're faced with what we're going to talk about next, which is the sandwich generation. So as I mentioned, again, adults who are simultaneously trying to meet the needs of elderly parents or maybe an elderly relative, and also raise young children. Because when we get to our chapter on marriage and the family, we'll see that people are postponing the age at which they get married. So they're getting married at later ages, having children maybe also at a later age, at an older age, I should say. And so you have young children, and you're sandwiched between caring for your young children and your young family, but also for elderly parents who are living longer. So the generation of adults is known as the sandwich generation, and they are the adults who simultaneously try to meet the competing needs of their parents and of their own children. By 2010, 13 million Americans were caring for both children and parents. The role of caring for aging parents falls disproportionately on women, and women provide 66% of this care that the parents receive. This is so significant, this role is so significant that President Obama during his administration in his 2010 State of the Union address, called for tax credits for families who care for both children and parents. So I got to remember hearing him discuss that in that speech. So it is a very significant role that needs to be taken care of. So we take care of our elderly, but also young families as well. According to Levinson, the last major transition occurs after the age of 60. So this last major transition occurring after age 60 causes dramatic changes in people's everyday lives. And it results in a completely different lifestyle. And so we consider this a big rite of passage. It marks a critical transition from one phase of a person's life to another. And this is really where it gets very challenging in a person's life course and in a person's socialization process. We've talked about socialization and how challenging it is to socialize, young children. But it's when we're older that the real challenges are faced, because we've, spent a number of years in the workforce. So say if we started working, the typical person maybe starts working between 16 and 18, I'll say, depending on, what you're doing in school and so forth. And we work all the way through. If you say people work through age 65, that's a lot of years to be in the workforce. You may change jobs a couple of times, but for the most part, you're working in a particular occupation. So when we retire, and we become so closely connected to that occupation that we say, I am this person. I am a teacher. I am a dentist. I am a nurse, or whatever the occupation is that you become, it becomes a part of who you are and what you identify with. So when we retire, it is a rite of passage, and it's this critical transition where we're ending one phase of our life and moving into another. Now, from 1950 to the mid-1990s, the average age at retirement declined. So there's just a little bit of demographics that happened recently. It has reversed recently, and so the direction has begun to increase. After the recession, a lot of people, instead of retiring, would stay in their jobs because they needed to. They needed the health insurance. They needed to still contribute to their retirement plans if they had them in their jobs. So, for example, this is just example, some data. As of late 2012, 5% of women and 11% of men over the age of 75 were still working. The highest percentages ever recorded for both males and females. So some of the reasons, as I just mentioned, there may have been changes in Social Security benefits, the recent economic recession, and also, the concern for maintaining that health insurance and pension benefits, which resulted in a lot of people choosing to stay in their jobs. And so for many people, though, it was a choice. They did want to still stay working. So gerontologist Robert Atchley, who we've already mentioned before, in 1976 identified phases of the retirement experience. So we're going to talk about those next. So here are Atchley's phases of retirement. So we've got pre-retirement. Now this is the period of anticipatory socialization as the individual really starts to prepare for retirement, starts to really think about it, and thinking that maybe it's that time. The near phase is when a specific retirement date is established. So we know that, okay, so you set that retirement date. Then we go into this honeymoon phase. And this is a period of euphoria when the person really is starting to think about, pursuing activities that they never had time for before. Maybe, they had a retirement party that, so many people were celebrating their retirement and entering that new phase. And so they're really enjoying time, the extra time that they have to do a lot of things that they couldn't do before while they were working. And then we hit the disenchantment phase. And retiree starts to feel a sense of letdown at this point. Depression might set in for some. They start to cope with this new life. And for some, it could include illness. For many, being in poverty, you're not making the salary you once were. You're still maybe receiving some income benefits, but it may not be to the extent that you were when you were working. The reorientation phase involves the development of a really more realistic view of retirement. People start to really work within their means. They're starting to realize that their income is not what it once was, and so that's where we see that reorientation phase. The stability phase is when the individual has learned to deal with life after retirement. So kind of a sort of routine sets in. And then the final stage is the termination phase. And this begins when the person no longer can engage in the basic day-to-day activities like self-care or housework. And so the person's really starting to slow down at this point. So any activities of daily living, the ADLs that we talk about in the healthcare side of things, we start to see those start to slow down. And somebody, the person might need some help around the house and so forth. Now, the length and timing of each of these phases varies by individual. Some people may not go through all of the phases. Some may not, feel depressed or anything like that. That euphoria might stay, and so each person experiences this differently. And the experiences of retirement also varies with gender, race, and ethnicity, and really, again, how society values that individual. Do they still feel valued? Do they still feel productive in their families and their communities and so forth? Something I want to mention here are what we refer to as naturally occurring retirement communities, or NORCs we call them. And this is when older people kind of congregate in areas that have gradually become these informal centers for senior citizens. So it might be a neighborhood where quite a few seniors are still living in their homes, and so you might have, the senior citizen community center in the area. You might have, pharmacies and even doctor's offices that kind of really emerge in a particular area. So these are where many older Americans choose to live rather than, a nursing home or a planned retirement community. So they become very informal types of centers for seniors. And they often emerge as singles and young couples move out, and older people might start to move in. So residents of these communities feel very threatened by gentrification, which is when low-income neighborhoods are taken over by higher-income residents. So, these naturally occurring retirement communities are threatened by that as well. One of the things we do, which is often many people don't like to talk about, but it's something that we often need to kind of have the conversation about, is death and dying. The ultimate role transition of life, of our life course, that comes much, much later, rather than sooner, is death and dying. And psychologist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, in 1969, wrote her book on death and dying, where she studied 200 cancer patients and encouraged the open discussion of the process of dying. And she called it a process. And what she did was identified 5 stages of the dying experience. And the first is the denial, or denying the truth to oneself. The second stage is a period of anger. You're angry at the thought of, that they're passing on. Then there's the bargaining stage, where a person might bargain with the higher being, with God, with anyone, the doctors. If I do this, can I live longer? Can I have, buy more time? And then, the stage of depression. And so a person might get depressed, and then finally where the person accepts. And these stages have been challenged quite a bit, so by other researchers. First of all, because of the small sample size, but it has held the test of time, where many people have actually even adopted these stages, not only with the process of death and dying, but also when someone is diagnosed with a condition like MS, multiple sclerosis, or even autism. I recall my husband and I, we may have hit these stages at different points in our experience when our children were diagnosed with autism. But you deny it at first, and then you bargain, with, well, if we do this and he'll get better, or and then there's a point of depression where your life is not what it is expected to be, and then you finally accept it, and you realize that there's this is something that you need to accept and learn to live with. And so this all really stems from, her research on cancer patients and how she did interviews with them. Functionalists actually view those who are dying as really fulfilling a distinct social function. And so what they found that, this concept is really where people are starting to transition into this phase. They might start to think about settling legal matters, putting things in order. I know my mother was quite adamant about this, because we had already experienced the loss of my father, and so now she herself wanted to put things in order and didn't want that to kind of be something that wasn't settled. It was her own, way of taking control of things. She also was, trying to, plan as much of her arrangements and make it known what she wished for at the end. But many other people too, maybe they haven't talked to a relative in a long time, so they start to restore those social relationships. They might say their goodbyes, if they have the opportunity to visit and talk with family members or friends. Handle any kind of medical care, medical needs, and make any kind of pre-preparations, making funeral arrangements or plans. And doing all this, some people might think it's morbid or something depressing to think about, but in doing this, in taking these steps, it's a way for the person to make that smooth intergenerational transition. And so a functionalist would look at it that way. It's a way to meet the needs that they have for themselves and have that smooth, transition, and with little, disruption of the social system. So even with the loss of one member of society, of a member of a family, of a member of a community, it allows that person to take some control over something that's uncontrollable. Hospice is a way to address this and this concept from a functionalist perspective of that good death. And so a hospice care was founded in London originally in 1967 on the concept of improving the quality of dying. Hospice workers seek to improve the dying person's last days by helping them stay at home as long as possible in their own home or in a home-like environment. Again, it's another thing I had some experience with my own mother. She suffered dementia at the end of her life, and we needed hospice care to be there to help not only her, but also all the family members to help cope with what was transpiring, what was happening to the family. There are currently 3,400 hospice programs serving over 1 million people a year. This is according to the Hospice Association of America. Studies in the U.S. indicate that people are really breaking through these historic taboos about death, and by again trying to take back control over something that's uncontrollable. Writing a will, living wills are something that we should all be familiar with as well. If nobody knows what a living will is, it's a lot of times they'll ask you at a doctor's office or at the hospital if you ever. What are your end of life wishes? Do you want to be on life support? Are you donating organs? Making those final arrangements, funeral arrangements, so that your family members are not left with making decisions that they're unsure about what your wishes are. So again, an uncomfortable thing to talk about, but that's why I'm talking about it for you. And so some people really do want to have these things spoken about, and then there's other people who may not, and that's okay. But just so you know and are aware. So because another, the last module in this chapter is how, the demographics and how age is, we're seeing this, what we call the graying of America. People over 100 years old now constitute the fastest growing age group in the United States. So we're seeing this in, increasing proportion of the population that will be older. And when we see a large population of older people, they're going to be hitting other social institutions in society. So in the future, an increasing proportion of the U.S. population will be composed of older people. We call these the oldest old. These are people aged 85 and older, and they're growing at the fastest rate, as I mentioned. So the elderly are more likely to be female than male. They're more likely to be white and non-Hispanic, about 80%. And the highest proportions of older people are in states like Florida, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Iowa, West Virginia, and Arkansas. So we call, again, this the graying of America. So we know that men have higher death rates, so we're going to see more elderly females than males, more likely to be white and non-Hispanic. Racial and ethnic minorities have higher death rates. Younger Latinos and Asians continue to immigrate to the United States, and elderly, nevertheless, are becoming more racially and ethnic diverse. So we see that diversity as well. As more people, again, start to live more healthy, active lifestyles. So as they age, we're seeing that. And as I mentioned, some of the states here, Florida really is a high proportion of, it was the state with the most populated elderly. But states like Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Iowa, West Virginia, Arkansas, any place where there's a warmer climate, a lot of elderly like to migrate into areas where the climate is a little bit warmer. In 25 years, more than half of the states will have elderly populations exceeding what Florida has currently. So we are seeing, again, the growth in this elderly population in all parts of the United States. So here we have, again, the percentage of U.S. population by selected groups. And this is, you could see by these years, 1970, what percent, that percent has we've seen the larger population that's growing in that green category. These numbers are important, especially when it comes to politics, when it comes to, when we see, presidential elections, and who are these people voting for? Because they're the ones that go out to the polls. The younger generation has to get out there and vote more. And here we see, in terms of the minority population, age 65 and older, we see how these percentages are continuing to grow and what they're projected to grow as well. And as I said, more states, these are 28 Floridas by the year 2030. So more states across the United States are going to start looking like Florida, where at least 20% of the population will be over the age of 65. And those are those grade-in states. All right. Another thing I want to talk about is wealth and income. Older people are neither homogeneous nor are they poor. The typical older person has a higher standard of living than in the nation's past. And this is due primarily to a greater accumulation of wealth in the form of home ownership. Excuse me. Private pension plans, and other financial assets that the person may have accumulated. Social Security provides 39% of elderly income. Groups that are more likely to be poor at earlier points in the life cycle, such as female-headed households and racial and ethnic minorities, are also more likely to be poor in old age. Now, ageism is something we need to talk about. Dr. Robert Butler, in 1990, coined the term ageism to refer to the prejudice and discrimination against people because of their age. For many people, old age symbolizes disease. We think of the aging process as somebody who's sick, but it's really it's a process. For many people, old age symbolizes that. We don't want to get that. We don't want to get older. We invest a lot of time and energy into staying young. We have lotions and potions. We dye our hair, so it's not gray, or we try to conceal our wrinkly skin, and we use products and lotions to prevent that. And so we do spend and there's a lot of marketing against, looking younger and feeling younger, and what to eat, to help you feel younger, what kind of vitamins to take and what exercise programs to do. But, there's nothing, sometimes we can do to control that. Physical condition does tend to weaken with age. But today's older people are in much better shape than their counterparts a generation ago. We know that more people have stayed, actively, physically fit, eating good food, and staying, in a good condition. Plus, we have, a lot of medical interventions that are help keeping people young, and again, there's a decrease in disease and illness. Older people are also not as visible on TV. I think Betty White might be the only person that comes to mind, and where I see, have seen her on a lot of programs still at her age. But if they are, sometimes you also see them in a negative light. They can't remember things, or they're moving too slow, and so you see, a lot of elderly people viewed in a negative. People who have a positive perception of aging will live 7.5 years longer. So that's something to keep in mind. Something called the silver collar economy is where we're seeing people being hired at age 65 and older because of the belief that they're much more reliable and more productive. So again, while physical condition weakens, with age, today's elderly are in much better shape physically. They are, again, much more reliable. They have a lot of wisdom to share. And so, again, to be pushing them out of the labor force when they still have a lot of productive years left is something we're seeing a change in. Older workers, do face discrimination in the labor force. So that's something we'll talk about. Again, it's in terms of ageism. They are often viewed as, older workers are seen by some as job stealers, staying in that labor market, not freeing up an occupation for a younger worker. In 2002, for first time, more older people were working full-time than they were working part-time. So we talked about some of the reasons why some are still in the labor market. And so we even have a breakdown by men and women, 36% of men and 26% of women. This is statistics from 2008. Those people who are age 65 to 69 were still in the paid labor force. So because of the economy, some have really postponed retirement. People need to stay in their jobs for, to still maintain an income. Maybe they don't have a retirement plan, and so they need to work. And so, they may need the health benefits and the pension plan. So some people do view them as job stealers. Now, the Federal Age Discrimination and Employment Act, or the ADEA, went into effect in 1968 to protect workers aged 40 and older from being fired because of their age. The courts have strengthened this protection and have made decisions in favor of older workers. So older workers can be an asset for employers. They often have lower rates of absenteeism. They're effective salespersons. And only 14% of workers confident of living comfortably in retirement. So again, that percentage is what's really, we're seeing so many people still in the workforce at this age. And so what these pie charts illustrate is labor force by age. And then you want to see that beige portion of the pie in each year, 2006, and what's projected into 2026 is that age group 55 and older. That is growing and still in the labor force. So when you think about a collective consciousness, the emergence of a collective consciousness, awareness of the social power of the elderly as a group is growing. The largest organization that represents the elderly is the AARP. And this was founded in 1958 by a retired high school principal by the name of Dr. Ethel Percy Andrus. And she was having difficulty getting health insurance. And AARP stands for the American Association of Retired Persons. It's a very powerful lobbying organization. As I said, they start recruiting you at a very young age. 50 is young. No. I still think it's young. But anyway, it is the largest volunteer organization in the U.S. They mobilize. They have helped so many groups and supported so many groups. So they've become very powerful in their lobbying to protect the elderly. Many groups have formed to help the elderly in more specific ways. We have the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare that was founded in 1982. And there's also the Senior Action in Gay Empowerment, which SAGE is referred to as, was established in 1977 in New York to address the needs of elderly homosexuals. So again, forming our organizations for, again, variety of groups. So finally, the elderly are physically and financially better off today than ever, but they are considered a very diverse group in the U.S. and around the world. So we can keep in mind, the world is graying. We're seeing a large demographic. If you look at any kind of population tables in demography, we see this large bubble of elderly people. So they've established this collective consciousness that all elderly face similar issues, just like women did. So it's not a false consciousness. I'm the only elderly person, I'm the only woman facing this or going through this. It's a collective consciousness where so they can mobilize and become very powerful in supporting the elderly population.